Good morning. Our gospel reading this morning is from Mark. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The gospel of the Lord. This gospel reading is often titled, "Jesus Stills the Storm." It's a dramatic story. On the sea, the disciples experience fear, doubt, rescue, and wonder. It's a short story, but it's found almost word for word in all three synoptic gospels. Did we lose a little sound there? I think we did. Did we lose? You okay?
Yeah.
I heard a shift. Could be my hearing. I'm getting old. So it's a short story, but it's found almost word for word in all three synoptic gospels. And that usually means that we should take special notice. The American artist Walter Salmon was most famous for his portraits of Jesus. His painting, The Head of Christ, is the one usually hung on Sunday school walls. One of his lesser-known paintings is entitled Christ Our Pilot. It shows a young man at the helm of a ship's wheel with Christ behind him pointing the way. And it's a wonderful image for today's reading, and it would have been a good one for me to remember when I found myself in troubled waters a few years ago. As it turns out, the reading and that painting form a segue into a Father's Day remembrance. We had a family cottage in northern Ontario, Canada, and it was a rustic place that always needed some kind of repair. My father wasn't a true handyman, but he knew the best person to call when something needed fixing. And he knew a lot about boats, motorboats, rowboats, sailboats, and canoes. And he taught me how to start a bulky engine and how to change a shear pin on a propeller. Mostly, though, we left the boat maintenance and navigation to him. He was the go-to guy. As the years passed, even though I was an adult with a career and married and children, Dad was still the go-to guy for many things. When my mother passed away, Dad wanted me to go with him to take her ashes up to the cottage. And he asked me to go along with a 6-hour road trip. So we went together, and I was glad to be with him at this sad time. But when we got to the cottage and dragged the canoe from behind the shed, it was apparent that Dad's waning strength and his arthritic knees would not allow him to get into that canoe to safely paddle out onto the lake. I would have to do it alone. I'd never paddled a canoe without him. I climbed in and placed the box of ashes by the seat, and I pushed off. And of course, within a few minutes, the wind came up. Dad paced along the shore, shouting encouragement and directions. And I managed to put Mother's ashes into the lake and say a very fast prayer. But then I had to turn the canoe into the wind and get back to the dock. I wasn't sure how to do it, but Dad continued to give me calm direction from the shore, and I managed to get the canoe safely back to the dock, scraping the bottom only a little bit. I know that God was with me that day, but truthfully, I don't think I acknowledged God directly at that moment. But God is so patient, and God waits, and so I thank God formally and publicly today. That day at the lake was a revelation for me and for Dad. Dad would always be my go-to guy, and I would always seek his advice, but from that day on, we both knew that our roles were slowly reversing. As he aged, I would have to take on the parent role, assisting him as needed and preserving his dignity until his death. So you may be thinking, well, she got that Father's Day message in there, and there were some parallels to the gospel storm story. But Jesus didn't calm the wind at her lake that day, and she didn't really put God into the center of the story. Well, there's a modern hymn by Scott Cripney that connects things a bit. One of the verses says, "Sometimes God calms the storm. Sometimes God calms the child." The child. We're all children of God, as were the 12 disciples. They were very immature, new at understanding who Jesus was and what he came to do and what role they would play. Before the storm at Galilee, Jesus had been preaching and healing and telling parables. Sometimes the disciples were confused, and Jesus would have to explain the parables to them in private. And Jesus was very special to them, but he was still very human to them. A gifted preacher, a healer, sent from God, but still human. And this human preacher, this miracle worker, was slowly being revealed to them as divine. But they needed something personal and dramatic, something to help them with their faith. And so Jesus says, let's go across to the other side. Perhaps he did this to show them more clearly the other side of himself, his divine side. They set out on the sea, and then a great windstorm comes up, and the boat is being swamped by the waves. Even the experienced fishermen among them were afraid, crying, "We are perishing." And where is Jesus? Jesus is sleeping. Some say he's merely resting and waiting to be called. But the scared disciples actually accuse Jesus of not caring. Jesus gets up and rebukes the wind and sea. "Peace, be still," and all is calm. Now, many artists paint Jesus at the bow of the boat with his hands outstretched. None of the Gospels have him there. None of the Gospels have his hands outstretched. Why? Because Jesus needs no gestures. Jesus needs only his voice. God created the wind and the sea. God spoke them into being. And Jesus, with his voice, can speak to the wind and sea and calm them into submission. And Jesus can do this with his words because he is the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. Well, once the sea was calm, Jesus turned to the disciples. "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they can't answer. That's the storm story. Fear, doubt, rescue, wonder. The disciples stand in wonder. Who then is this man that even the wind and the sea obey him? The disciples are still a little short on faith, still a little short in believing that Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah. They'll get there, but it'll take time. What about our faith, our believing? When we find ourselves in troubled waters, to whom do we turn? We do have helpers. We know that family and friends and professionals can help us, but what about the times when the storms of life just won't let up? When there is a roar of wind and confusion swirling in our head or tearing at our hearts? Times when we think that Jesus must be asleep on that cushion somewhere, oblivious to our cries. We ask, why can't he just come and calm our storm? Why doesn't he answer? Perhaps we can't hear his voice above the storm. Perhaps we're listening to other voices or our own shrill voice crying out. Jesus rebuked the wind and the waves. He told them to be still. The psalm reminds us to do likewise. Be still and know that I am God. Be still. In the still silence of prayer, Jesus will speak to us, and answer will come. Solace will come, and we will be rescued. Our rescue, however, may not come as we imagine. Sometimes God calms the storm. Sometimes God calms the child. If God's answer appears to be contrary to our specific, detailed request, to the well-defined rescue that we expect, we may turn away. We may try to tough it out on our own. We may grit our teeth and grab the wheel like a captain and decide to steer ourselves out of the storm with or without God's help. There's a poem that many use in this situation, and it's called Invictus, written in 1875 by Will Henley. Oh, I saw someone nod their head. You do know it, at least part of it. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced or cried aloud under the bludgeoning of chance. My head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. That poem was quoted by Winston Churchill to inspire the British nation. It was cited by Vietnam prisoners of war and by Nelson Mandela in prison. And those are noble uses of the poem, but poetry can offer different meanings to each reader. A case in point is Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. He chose that same poem as his final statement at his execution. So much as a poem may inspire, the element of God is missing. The poem wants us to believe that sheer will can overcome any adversity, and the poem leaves no room for God. There is, however, a Christian counterpoint to that poem, a version written by Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic worker movement. In her poem, she turns things around. Out of the night that dazzles me, bright as the sun from pole to pole, I thank God I know to be for Christ, the conqueror of my soul. Since his the sway of circumstance, I would not wince or cry aloud under the rule that men call chance. My head with joy is humbly bowed. Beyond this place of sin and tears, that life with him and his the aid that spite the menace of the years keeps and will keep me unafraid. I have no fear though strait the gate, he cleared from punishment the scroll. Christ is the master of my fate. Christ is the captain of my soul. The storms of life will continue to rage. We'll all find ourselves in trials and tempests. We may have good intentions and all the courage in the world, but it won't be enough to save us. Self-courage can't save us from a heavy heart or a sin-sick soul or the tragedies of this earthly life. We may even come to think that our prayers are unanswered and that Jesus is sleeping in the stern. Jesus is not sleeping. The earthly Jesus, the historical Jesus in his human form, needed a little downtime, a short nap. But the living Christ, the Lord God of Israel, neither slumbers nor sleeps. He comes right to our side if only we call him. He travels with us, and the journey we get may not be of our choosing, but Christ will bring peace to our souls. Christ will journey with us until the last storm subsides. And so we listen for his voice. Even over the noise of wind and rain and thunder of life, Christ, our captain, will be heard. He'll help us weather any storm because he is the master of our fate. He is the captain of our souls. Amen.